We're here tonight to discuss, as best we can, Obama's strategy in the Gulf, the drilling moratorium, and what it means to Houston. This is very important because we are certainly facing the potential of tens of thousands of losses in jobs and a very uncertain future. As we know, the Obama administration never likes to see a good crisis go to waste. And that's what we are the victims of here. When the BP explosion happened, our future became very uncertain in that instant. So we sought out an industry expert who could speak to the truth of what the Obama administration is doing in the Gulf. And our search led us directly to our first speaker of the evening, Mr. Bruce Vincent. Mr. Vincent is chairman of the IPAA, which is the International Petroleum Association of America. The IPAA represents the thousands of independent oil and natural gas producers and service companies across the United States. Mr. Vincent is also the president and director of Swift Energy Company. And I want to get to this as a member of the National Petroleum Council and Oil and Natural Gas Advisory Committee that represents the views of the oil and natural gas industry in advising, informing, and making recommendations to the Secretary of Energy. Now my question, has that been replaced by the Czar of Energy or still report to the Secretary? So we are thrilled to have with us tonight Mr. Vincent, who will most certainly educate us on the truth of what is happening in our community and in our waters in the Gulf. Mr. Bruce Vincent.
Thank you, Catherine. Before I start, thank you for your service. I can't tell you how much that means to all of us. I grew up in the Vietnam era. Looking across the room, I see some gray hair. I know some of you did as well. And when our soldiers came back from Vietnam, they weren't welcome the way they are today, and I appreciate the America's attitude towards our military and our service. It's so important. It's why this country exists. It's why we have the life that we live. Freedom. Exactly right. I'm going to talk to you today about a couple things, principally about the moratorium. But as I talk, I'd like you to think about the old cliche of seeing the forest through the trees. Understand the difference between the big picture that we really need to step back and look at versus some of the little things that we really get focused on, and that's where a lot of the attention goes. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about who independents are. I'm going to talk about the moratorium, how it got started, what are some of the impacts. There's a handout with some of the statistics on it. I'll just highlight a few of them, but more of them are in that handout for your information. If I have time, I'm going to talk a little bit about energy today and energy supply and what we view as an American treasure, natural gas. The United States has the largest supply of natural gas in the world. It can power us for well over 100 years. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the energy policy issues that confront us today. I know Congressman Brady is going to get into more of that detail, so I won't get too deep into that. And then I want to talk a little bit about, to help you understand the economic benefits and the importance of energy to our way of life and to our national security. Before I do that, I want to tell a story. And it's a story that probably many of you have heard. I've actually heard a couple of different versions of it. But it's a good story to make a good point that I hope will also help you think about seeing the forest through the trees. It's about a college professor who wanted to make a point with his class. And as they walked in, he had a couple hundred students in the classroom. And they all kind of sat up there, some in the front row, perky and interested, others in the back row, slouched back there because they had to be. And he had a table in front of him with nothing on it. And all of a sudden, underneath the table, he reaches down and he pulls out this big glass container with a narrow neck on it. And he reaches down again and pulls out another container, kind of a bucket, full of these big rocks. And he takes these rocks and places them one by one through the neck of this container and fill it up. When it was full, he asked the class, "Well, is the container full?" And they said, "Yes, sir, it is." "No, it's not full yet." Reached down under the counter and pulled out another container This was a lot of smaller pebbles in it. And he took that container and started pouring the pebbles into the glass beacon until it was full. He'll chuck it around a little bit, wiped off the excess pebbles, and now the glass container was full. So he asked his class, is it full now? Yes. What do you think? No, it wasn't full yet. Some of you heard the story. But he reaches down underneath the table and he pulls out a bucket of sand. And he starts sprinkling the sand in the container, shakes the glass a little bit more, shakes some more, and finally the container's full with the sand. And he wipes the hand off the top. Says, all right, class, are we full now? Not yet. Reaches down under the table one more time and he pulls out a 6-pack of beer. And he opens the first beer and starts pouring it in. Not full yet. Opens the second beer, pours it in, opens the third, opens the fourth. Finally, the sand is saturated with beer. And so he asks the class, well, are we full now? Yes, we're full now. He said, all right, well, what is the point of that story, the illustration that we made today? Up in the front row, you got a couple of kids just bouncing up and down, raising their hand, they know the answer, and they want to tell everybody. But in the back, there's this one slacker who's been slouching the whole time, slowly raises his hand up like that. And so the professor says, I'm going to call on him. Okay, you in the back, what's the point of the story? Well, it just goes to show that no matter how full you are, there's still room for beer. That's the version that I like because it's funny. But the point of that story is you got to put the big rocks in first. That story is a really good story to talk about when you're talking about life. The things in your life that are the big rocks. Your family, your community, your spirituality, your friends. The big rocks are what's important. It's not whether I got there on time or was able to do this or that. It's the big rocks. And the same is true with policy. The same is true with our government in Washington. We got to fix the big rocks first. If we don't fix the big rocks and lay the right foundation, we're going to be fighting these little rocks all the time. And a lot of what you read about in the paper, you hear about TV, and some things I'll talk about, the Congressman talking about, are the little rocks. We've got to look beyond the trees. We've got to understand what the forest is. That's where the real fight is. It's a long-term fight. Because I can tell you the people on the other side that believe differently than we believe have long-term strategies and are thinking about the big rocks from their perspective. And if we want this country to be all that it can be, to be all that it has been, and to be proud of it the way all of you are, we need to focus on the big rocks. So independence. Who are independents? Everybody thinks about the oil and gas business as Exxon and Shell and Chevron and BP. And I always figure the reason for that is because that's how we touch it. You know, all of us have a car. We all go fill it up, and we fill it up with some major oil company insignia on it. So you think big oil is oil. Not in the U.S., it's not. Independent oil and gas companies are small businesses. They average 20 or less employees in business, and they drill 90% of the wells in this country. They produce 82% of the natural gas in this country and 68% of the oil. It is independents, many of whom you've never heard of, many of them private. There are some large public company independents, but most of them are private. Over 5,000 independent oil and gas companies across this country in every producing state in America that drill the wells, that produce the oil, produce the natural gas, that power this country. And one of our big concerns is the policies that are being espoused today to punish big oil only hurt the independent. Yeah. And it's the independent that drives the energy business in this country. And we're so ever thankful to have people like Congressman Brady in Congress who understand the independent and fight for us. He done a terrific job in this past week fighting off some really tough stuff in the CLEAR Act that was passed by the House. Couldn't get it all out of there, but has done a good job in taking a leadership position there, and I'll let him talk about some of that detail when he gets up here. Before I talk about the moratorium, let me take what I call a timeout for safety. Safety and a safety-first culture is a very challenging thing for businesses to inbreed within the culture of your company. It's a challenge. Every business, whether it's a manufacturing business or whatever, thinks about safety. I can tell you in our business, in our industry, we live and breathe it. And as a company, you have to try to make it instinctive within your people so that they live and breathe safety first. Not just when they're drilling a well and go to a safety meeting. No, it's a safety meeting. They live and breathe it at home with their families, when they drive a car, and everything that they do, they think safety first instinctively. And I think most of our companies have inbred that in their operations. It's also tragic what happened with the Deepwater Horizon incident. Most of us in the industry are stunned that it did. Virtually all of us never thought that it could happen. Many of us don't believe it should have happened. But one of the things all of us know is that we need to understand exactly what happened before we start devising policy initiatives to correct something. And so it's fundamentally important that we take the time to understand exactly what happened. The other thing that's fundamentally important is to take a time out for safety. When you have an accident, that's what you do. Well, our industry and their respective companies, I know we have in ours, have done that. We've taken a time out for safety. The government has to some extent. They went and inspected all the 33 other deep water rigs that were out there. And you probably heard about that. What you didn't hear about were the results of that. An inspection of all those rigs found 4 infractions. And to give you an example of one of the 4, I don't remember what all 4 of them were, but one of them was the eye washer fluid that was there to rinse your eyes at it to get exposed to something had an expired expiration date on it. Those rigs are all ready to get back to work. Those companies have taken this time out for safety. Those companies reviewed their well plans. I can tell you, management has put their own people through the drill to be sure and convince them that they can drill those wells safely. We believe we can. We don't think there is any reason to continue this moratorium whatsoever. It's a highly improbable event to begin with. If you look at the industry's track record, the last major offshore blowout was in 1969, 40 years ago in Santa Barbara. Yet the administration felt that we needed to take a time out, and they created this moratorium. And they talk about it being a moratorium in the deep water. That when they lost the first court case, they changed the definition, but it was effectively the same thing. But the fact of the matter is there's a de facto moratorium in the shallow waters as well because they're not issuing permits. They've created these hurdles that are so difficult to get over. They're just not issuing the permits. I know of one for sure that's been issued. I think there may be 2. Congressman may be a little more up to date on that. But the fact is they're just not issuing permits. So there's a de facto moratorium. Catherine kidded about an energy czar. Well, there is an energy czar. It's Carol Browner. You don't see much of her. But essentially, the Department of Interior, the Department of Energy, and the EPA report into her. And she's got the last word into Obama's ear about energy policy and environmental policy. Now, the moratorium, well, we believe initially you should do what we did on our own, take a time out for safety, is not something that needs to continue, but it's having, and will continue to have, what we believe are devastating impacts, at a minimum on the Gulf Coast states in the short run, on jobs, on economic well-being, but in the long run will have an impact throughout the country. Because the ultimate impact of economic well-being in the Gulf Coast spreads itself, multiplies, the domino effect throughout the country. But also the supply of oil, the supply of natural gas will ultimately decline from what's produced in America. And what does that mean? We're just going to import more. You think, oh, Hugo Chavez is going to, oh, sure, what do you need? I think President Ahmadinejad would say, sure, what do you need? We're going to import it from states like that who are not countries that we can rely on, not countries we want to send our wealth to. We'd much rather have jobs in America, producing America's resources, spreading that economic well-being across this country. And it's not just... It's not just the oil and gas industry. There are tremendous supporting jobs that affect every well that's been drilled. And then the people that work in these jobs, whether the offshore workers who actually are out on the rigs, whether it's the food service companies that supply the food to the rigs, whether it's the helicopter companies or boat companies that transport goods, services, and people out there, all come home to Louisiana and Texas, and that's where they spend their money. That's where they go to the movies, that's where they go out to dinner, that's where they go to the local restaurant, hamburger stand, and take their laundry. It is that economic well-being that multiplies through the communities across the Gulf Coast states that we just don't have. And these Gulf Coast states, particularly Louisiana, are already being devastated because of the lost business in some of their natural industries like fishing and tourism. A good friend of mine just spent a week in Destin, Florida, last week, and said the beaches there are pristine. Would you know that if you watch TV? Not at all. But they're pristine. And Destin's a wonderful place, and it's beautiful today. But the tourism is suffering because both the moratorium and then the publicity surrounding it. You know, on that handout, there's a recent study that just came out last week. IHS Global Insight did it. They actually took a look at what would be the impact if independents, companies like ours, were excluded from the Gulf of Mexico. And some of the policies they're talking about will absolutely do that. We can talk about that if we have time. But if you look at last year's numbers, so this is what it could be next year if you actually have them, or a little bit higher, over 200,000 jobs would have been lost in 2009 if independents were excluded from the Gulf of Mexico. Almost 300,000 in 2015 and over 300,000 in 2020. One of the other things many people don't know, if you look at the U.S. Treasury, where does the U.S. Treasury get most of its money? Income taxes, right. Where do they get the second largest component of their money?
Oil leases.
The oil and gas industry. Oil and gas revenues, primarily from royalties and lease bonuses, provide the second largest source into the U.S. Treasury. And the potential loss of tax and royalty revenue in the federal government had it been last year is over $7 billion. 2015 would be $10 billion. Almost $10 billion in 2020. So that's roughly $10 billion a year for the next 10 years, $100 billion. Because you're not developing our country's resources. You know, one of the interesting things about this debate that's always kind of been interesting to me, those of you that might have been involved in international business can appreciate this, but most countries around the world actually hire marketing people or business development people and come over here and encourage and entice companies like ours, please come over and drill in our country. Develop our resources. They want you there. The partnership between government and industry is a partnership. It's not adversarial. What we have today with our government is an adversarial relationship between business, the private sector, and government. That's not what government should be about. Government's there to promote the economy, to promote job growth, to work with businesses, to make this a better place to live and a better place for us to raise our children. What are we doing about it? And Catherine asked me to talk about what you can do about it. You're doing it to begin with. More than anything else, grassroots support makes the biggest difference. There is nothing better than going to your congressman's office in his home district when he's home on recess, he or she, and talking to them about policies in Washington and what you believe they need to be in order to promote the economy in your district. There's nothing more important, there should be nothing more important than real jobs in that member's district. And so what we need are people that are energized, that are active, that are educated, that want to understand the facts, that want to be involved. I talked a little about the forest through the trees, and I talked a little bit about the big rocks. You know, to some extent, going and meeting them this month may be a little rock, but where the big rock's coming in is November. You really got to give people in Washington, whatever party they are, that understand that the relationship between government and private sector needs to be a partnership working together to make this country great like it can be. And we need to put people in Washington who believe that. And it's not just within your district, it's throughout the country. And so what I would ask you to do is look throughout the country and see where you think you can make a difference, not just here, but elsewhere. Let me talk a little about the importance of energy in America, because energy drives this economy. It drives everything we do. Most people don't think about it because we're so spoiled with it. Some people say, well, what do we need oil and gas for? We got electricity. I'm telling you, people say that. It's like one member of Congress in the hearing said, asked one of the people testifying, well, why didn't BP drill the relief well first? You know, energy drives this economy, and the key component of energy, the bulk of the energy supply in the U.S. comes from oil and natural gas. Oil and natural gas provide well over 60% of the energy in today's economy. And if you look at virtually every credible forecast out there, it's going to provide over about 60% of the energy in the next 20 to 25 years. So how can we have any kind of an energy policy that doesn't promote and support the development of our resources here at home? Renewables are great. We think renewables are important. But wind and solar are such a small part. In 25 years from now, they're going to be bigger, but it's still going to be a small part. We need to look at the whole picture and have an energy policy that makes sense, not an energy policy that's driven by a particular constituency. Let the market decide. Let's not legislate winners and losers. I mentioned this earlier, is what we call an American treasure. We have recently discovered through technological advances a natural gas supply here in the U.S. that can power this country for over 100 years. It is larger than the oil that Saudi Arabia has. We are the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, and we need to develop those resources. We need to have policies that encourage that and advocate it. It's ours. I'm going to skip the policy issues and let Congressman Brady talk about that, and to the extent we want to get into some of the detail, we can do that in questions and answers. But just kind of to finish up, you know, oil and natural gas and energy are so essential to our country. They're essential to our American way of life. They create jobs. Those jobs ripple throughout the country. And they're fundamentally important to national security. You know, you hear people talk about energy independence. I don't like those words because I don't know that that's feasible, quite frankly. But if you want to talk about energy security, that's really, really important. We need to have this country less reliable on foreign sources, not more reliable. And to do that, we need to promote the development of American companies developing American resources. I'm going to turn it over to Congressman Brady to be sure that we kind of stay on schedule. Looking forward to questions and answers, so please fire them up. I'll be ready for them.
Okay, so part of our duo here is Congressman Brady, who issued a press release a couple weeks ago and had a notable quote here. By thumbing their noses at the federal courts, the Obama administration appears determined to shut down drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. He called it like he saw it, and he continues to do that in Washington. For that, we are very grateful. So let's hear Congressman Brady.
Well, thanks, Captain, obviously, for the invitation to be here tonight. It is nice to see friendly faces again. One, let me... yeah, a lot more friendly. Thank you for what Kingstreet Patriots does and are doing, bringing the Constitution back to America and taking this country back, but also thank you for what you do to recognize heroes like Sergeant Eddie Wright. There's a lot of ways to show we care, from your prayers to just wishing the best for a marriage full of love and joy and happiness. But Eddie really is amazing. I've got to know him over the last month or so. But you want to know what kind of hard charger he is? Catherine and I saw him propose to Cody on a Monday. On Sunday, I opened the paper and he's married. What a leader. It's been 2 weeks. You have kids in college yet? Or not? Slowing things down? Wow. It's pretty amazing. Well, we wish you the very best, and you're a very special couple. And I appreciate Bruce Vincent being here. IPWA has been a real leader. And to try to explain, lawmakers in Congress, I'm not sure they understand the difference between oil and natural gas. They certainly don't. Now they're not experts on offshore drilling. I'm not sure they understand the difference between the majors and the independents, between exploration wells and appraisal wells. I don't think they understand a bit on how tough it is. The money you invest, the entrepreneurial spirit, the technology, jobs, the capital equipment it takes to produce oil in America. IPAA does a great job explaining, but I have to point out to you, Bruce, you know the story about the beaker? If that were Washington, D.C., Democrats would tax the rocks, regulate the pebbles, claim the sand coming from the stimulus, and redistribute the beer, which is really... Being from Texas, the last one is really offensive. Really offensive. Fighting words for the most part. You asked the question, is the moratorium just beginning? And the answer is yes. Absolutely is just beginning. You ever seen these base jumpers who jump off buildings and skyscrapers and cannons and all that? You notice they have the backpack on the back, but they're holding something when they jump. It's called a pilot chute. And its job is that they catch speed, they throw it out there, it catches air, and pulls the rest of the parachute out with him. The drilling when it comes to stopping the production of oil and gas in America, the moratorium is the pilot chute. And with it is going to drag a lot of legislation. They're going to use this as an opportunity, the BP spill as an opportunity, I think, to drive a dagger through the heart of oil and gas production in America, in my view. The moratorium, as Bruce said, is damaging enough. Rigs are already starting to leave this coast, the Gulf, and they won't be back anytime soon. 2 have left for Egypt and the Congo. It ought to be a red flag when energy companies leave for West Africa looking for a stable government. Probably ought to tell you something. But with those rigs, we don't know how many will go. I think many of them are fighting to stay here, but every rig that leaves takes with it American jobs, American equipment, American capital, and at the end of the day, American energy. And the moratorium itself is so damaging. And I will tell you, if you listen to small businesses who are tied to these rigs and to the Gulf, and as Bruce said, this moratorium, this stop to energy production isn't just in deep waters, it is in the shallow waters. It is small and mid-sized and independent companies along with the majors, all of whom are creating U.S. jobs, good old-fashioned American jobs, good old-fashioned American energy. And they're fighting to survive, but what you get, every rig that leaves has got around 1,500 workers tied to that rig, but they'll have 1,000 vendors selling products or services. And those small businesses will tell you, they work like Blackhawk Specialty Tools told us. In the first month of the moratorium, we laid off 20% of our workforce. This month, we'll lay off 50% of our workforce. And the question that the owner of that company, small business, started 3 years ago, has 50 workers trying to expand, now doing just the opposite. And his question was a great one. How many businesses do you know that can survive 6 months without any revenue? Not many. Certainly not small and mid-sized businesses, and that's where we are today. We have challenged the administration, the White House, to end the moratorium. 3 weeks ago, I invited the president to come to Houston to meet with our energy workers and our businesses. So far, we haven't heard a word from him, but I know this August 9th, he's coming to Houston to raise money to fundraise for the Democratic Party. And so we said, look, Mr. President, can you give our energy workers just an hour? Can you give them just 15 minutes? Can you spare any time at all to meet with American citizens whose jobs and livelihood are risked, not because of BP, but because of your decision? And so far, what do you think we've heard? Nothing at this point. We're going to keep fighting that fight, because if he's coming down here, he's met in every other state about this oil spill. Come meet the job spill. Come see the job spill in the Gulf in Texas, because this is deadly serious for our economy and our future, and a lot of innocent people who had nothing to do with that spill. Part of that big parachute coming out now after the moratorium occurred this last week in Washington, the Clear Act. Bruce talked about it. It is a combination of 3 bills they put together and rushed through the House with, I would guess most members had no idea what was in it. But they use this spill as an excuse to go after their anti-oil and gas agenda. In the Clear Act, they do, in my view, the Clear Act drives American companies out of the Gulf. It kills up to 300,000 U.S. energy jobs, many of them here in Texas. Increases our dependence on foreign oil. Ultimately, eventually will drive up the price of fuel in America, and it includes a $22 billion tax on American oil, but not on foreign oil. Think about it. Yeah, it's a $2 barrel, 20 cents per million BTU on U.S. oil developed on federal lands, but not on the oil imported from the Middle East or Yugoslavia. What kind of law, what kind of bill is that? And if you look deep into it, what they did is they're using this as an excuse to move forward on the Clear Act with its damaging. They're looking at this as an excuse to move cap and trade, probably in a lame duck session. They're looking at legislation where the federal government can preempt states' decisions on oil and natural gas onshore in America. They're fighting again for that new $22 billion tax to fund land and water conservation. Look, land and water conservation, public parks, very important part of this country. But it has nothing to do with BP oil spill. Absolutely nothing to do with it. We ought not be taxing our families and small businesses to fulfill some dream on a new trust fund that no one's funded before. That's not right. They're looking at, in this bill, they have new restrictions on ocean zoning called, marine spatial planning. I think that's the phrase. Planning and zoning of our oceans, which eventually leads to problems for our fisheries and marine industries. They have hydraulic fracturing legislation that reveals the chemical components that are involved in removing shale, extracting shale, one of our greatest assets in the United States. They hate natural gas. And I'll tell you, they barely understand the difference. 2 years ago I read about a state lawmaker in Florida who was against expanding drilling in the Eastern Gulf because, quote, she didn't want natural gas washing up on their beaches. They are now overnight experts in offshore drilling. They're looking at this opportunity to expand renewable fuel standards that require you to go to other types of energy. They're looking at putting cash for caulkers, another one, on this federal law. They created a Made in America provision that on the surface sounds great, that every rig should be U.S. flag, built U.S., staffed by U.S. workers, repaired in the United States. So one, that doesn't make the Gulf any safer because every rig is already built to U.S. standards, inspected twice by U.S. agencies before they come to the Gulf, crewed by U.S. workers, repaired in U.S. shipyards. What this Made in America provision about, it is a big union make-or project for an industry that has lost its competitive edge around the world. And now if we put it in place, what we're doing, we're inviting other countries like Brazil and others to do the same thing. And when they say, like America, we just want Brazilian flag rigs, Brazilian crews, and it would be those rigs fixed in Brazil, guess what we lose? U.S. workers who are on those rigs, managing those rigs, and guess what those rigs get repaired? The United States of America. So what they're talking about for make-work project ends up costing jobs in the United States. And I always say this, from a trade standpoint, the world has changed. It is not enough to buy American. We have to sell American goods and services all throughout the globe. And when we, absolutely. I could go on. There are a number of provisions. It passed the House, and all but 3 Texas lawmakers voted against it. We lost 3 members. Well, it's on the back of your sheet here. 3 lawmakers voted for it, 1 in the Houston region. That bill now goes to the Senate. It looks like this week they won't get to that bill, is what we're hopeful, which means between now, just like the healthcare town hall meetings in August, we need to have the energy town hall meetings every week in every congressional district. We need energy workers, businesses, and their supporters to be calling and showing up in these congressional offices, as Bruce said, to let them know they're doing our jobs. And in Texas, 1.7 million jobs in Texas are supported by the energy industry. It's almost a quarter of our entire economy. There is no reason for any lawmaker from Texas to vote for a bill that kills oil and gas exploration in the Gulf of Mexico. Absolutely not. So we're going to need your help in driving that appointment home in August. I know there are a number of opportunities to do that we're going to talk about as we go forward, but I can just tell you that without your engagement, the narrative in Washington is this. And I'll list these rules. Look at number 12. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Pick the target, big oil, and exploration goal. Freeze it with the moratorium, personalize it. This is big oil against those families and birds in the Gulf. And then polarize it. Keep it at bay, tax it, regulate it, while the iron's hot, strike and drive us safe to it. That's exactly what's happening today in Washington, D.C. Unless we let our voice be heard, we will do more damage to the Texas and U.S. energy industry and the potential in the next month and a half than will have been done in the history of the United States. We got to have engaged. Thanks for having me here today.